If you want to create effective gameplay for your next VR game, then this episode is for you, so let's get to it. You are listening to the How to Create VR podcast, weekly conversations with VR and AR professional creators, designers, and producers. Hello and welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR podcast, where I speak with professional creators, designers, developers, and producers who work on VR, AR, and MR projects. I'm Marcelo, an immersive content specialist focused on e-learning and training. I'm also the creator and the guy behind howtocreatevr.com. My guest is Marriana Vallejo, the CEO and founder of Daily Magic Productions, a game development company behind the action-adventure VR game Witching Tower VR. Today, Marianna and I will have a conversation all about how to create effective gameplay for your next VR game. But before we get started, I want to remind you to register at howtocreatevr.com. It's free and registration gives you access to all our live events, tutorials, practice assets, podcast interviews, videos, and more. It's quick and easy. Just visit howtocreatevr.com and click on the register for free button. Finally, if you want to attend our meetup in virtual reality, join us inside AltSpace VR. Just visit howtocreatevr.com/AltSpaceVR and subscribe to our channel. All right, Marianna, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Very excited to be here.
Same here. I'm excited that you're here. You are in Seattle, right?
Yes, correct.
So why don't we start out by you giving us a bit of your background? How did you get into VR?
Sure. So I have background in game design, and I was always a fan of mystery games and anything mysterious or like dark themed. I founded Daily Magic when I saw the game Mystery Case Files, Return to Ravenhurst. It was a traditional PC flag game, and that inspired me to create similar story-driven experiences. And I founded Daily Magic 8 years ago in 2010, and since then, my company developed and shipped and launched more than 25 titles for various platforms. Most of them are kind of adventure genre. And when VR started to take off, I saw that it can really bring adventure genre to next level. So we jumped in there, and that's how we started in VR, and that's how the idea for Witching Tower came in.
How did you get into VR yourself as a user, as a player?
As a player, the first experience I tried was Vanishing Realms and the lab. And Vanishing Realms specifically impressed me a lot because how immersive it was. And I looked at it and I was like, oh, I can be inside this game now. And it's so great when you can create all these crazy environments, and it just feels so special just to be in there. And then you can also do some gameplay and play around, and that was even better. And when I tried the lab, I was most fascinated when that part of it where you're like on a little mountain and there's some robotic dog around you, and you can pet that dog and you can look around, and my mind was blown away.
What's your favorite experience today?
So the game that impressed me the most is the game called Defector. I tried it at Oculus Connect 5, and the game sets bar really high for both like adventure games, action games, even shooters in VR. It's very high quality, very high paced. There's a lot going on, a lot of mechanics. There's really high quality animations and realistic gameplay that is already very similar to what's going on PC and consoles. And you thought like VR is going to take much longer to get there, but that game is already like a huge step forward. And I really like that game. It's called Defector.
And for which platform is it? Was it, obviously you said the Oculus Connect, so was it for the Quest, for the Rift?
It was for the Rift. It's a pretty heavy game. There's like large environments and animations, and it requires a lot of processing power.
I see. Before we jump into game mechanics, you mentioned game mechanics, and we're going to talk about all about gameplay and how to make it effective and good game mechanics. HTC just announced yesterday, actually, and this is going to be a while later when we publish this, but January 7th, they announced 2 new HMDs, right? The Cosmos and the Vive Pro I. I just want to get your thoughts and take on any of that if you've heard about it.
Well, I only heard how everybody are discussing Cosmos now, and like it's a direct competitor to Oculus Quest, but the difference is that it can be powered by both
a PC, right,
and the phone. So that's very interesting, and I'm really excited to try it out. But like the whole trend is that having PC or phone attached to your headset is very annoying, and these companies are trying to get away from it and succeeding so far. They just need to ramp up the processing power and make those standalone headsets really powerful.
Well, the other thing that they announced was the Vive Pro I, which gives you now eye tracking capabilities. Why don't we start with that? I mean, what's your thought on eye tracking, and how can eye tracking be used for effective gameplay? Have you put in any thought into that yet?
For the eye tracking, it can be useful for gameplay because right now there's very little ways to control what your player is doing and how to bring like characters to them, because now you can only track the headset, and if like there's an enemy or somebody, you need to make sure it's in front of their headset, but not always it works, and they still miss things and they look around in different directions. So eye tracking can really help with that. And controlling where players looking in VR, I think it's one of the most challenging things at the moment.
Do you think that's something you will be using in your future games once it's widely available?
Possibly, yeah. Because in adventure genre specifically, you need to show player things at a very certain time, like trigger things happening, because you need to track, like, did they complete this and this quest? And then suddenly some like magic ghost appears in front of their eyes and tell them the truth.
Explain to us your workflow for designing gameplay, not so much for designing the graphics, but how do you go about the actual gameplay itself? And explain what you mean by gameplay.
So gameplay is a set of mechanics. First of all, features of the game, like you need to kind of figure out in the beginning what are the core things that player will be doing. Will they be fighting with sword and shield? Will they be picking up objects? Will they be applying objects to one another? Will you be breaking things? It's just a set of kind of actions that can be done. And that usually is done through Excel sheets, and you like list, this is a weak enemy, this is a strong enemy, this is a superior enemy, and then you list how much damage they do, how much damage they need to take to fall, and stuff like that. This is like the core thing. And then another thing, what I mean by gameplay, is a sequence. So especially in an adventure game, it's very sequential. It's a progression-based gameplay. So there's certain actions player need to do before they move on to the next location, or before something significant happens, like a character start talking to them, or they reveal a secret chamber with a new weapon or something like that. So behind the scenes, you kind of write down the sequence of events, and you write down what stops player from progressing further, or what stops them from getting to their goal, and how they can get to their goal. So on a very high level, that's what it is.
So do you do this scene by scene, or do you do this for the entire game? How do you break it apart? I mean, guide us through your thinking process. Do you go, okay, this is the overall theme of the game, and then we're going to have these 10 scenes, and then within the scenes, do you start doing the gameplay, or do you think of it overall and then start getting more detail? So guide us through that process.
So for the mechanics that is present in the game, they need to be designed for the whole game in the very beginning. So regardless of the location, this is the possible things that can be happening. So it's like your little bricks that you will be operating. Especially, this is very location-based design. So we know, like, okay, now we're in this upper floor of the tower. This is how the location look like, and this is the end point of that. So the last action in the gameplay is to open a passage to another location. And based on the architecture of that location and the enemies we're putting there, we build the sequence that leads to that passage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So I wanted to talk to you about, as you think through all of this, about interface design and how that affects gameplay, because in a flat game, right, you may have an interface where you're pressing buttons or doing whatever. I mean, the interface is separate from the person playing the game. In VR, you're kind of part of the interface, right? I mean, you're in there and you don't want to put in a flat interface because it breaks the immersion. So explain, what are your thoughts on interface design and how that affects gameplay?
So we learned a lot after, building a launch and reaching tower. And the best case scenario is when there's no interface whatsoever. And you just operate the controls on your controllers and...
Like in real life, you don't have stuff in front of you, right, to press.
Yeah, like in real life. You can have like occasional pop-up, like scores, or if something significant happened and something changed, you can just flash it to player. But static interface in VR is just not working. And we were challenged because it's an adventure game and you need to store inventory items with you and you need to bring stuff with you to other locations. So first we built the interface on the player's belt. So it was like kind of, realistic, like you do in real life. You have a tool belt and you have like your sword there, a torch, and there's a little bag that opens up and you can store any item there. But players didn't like it and we couldn't track their height. So for some players it was too low or too high. So we ended up putting that little bag on the hand. So on the hand you have a little pouch, you open it and there you can store anything you want. And that kind of worked, but it's still not ideal because in VR you just want to jump into action, whatever that action is. And just having those extra moves is very frustrating. And this will kind of limit your gameplay options to not have interface at all. And really think through the control buttons, because you can use all of them, but for more casual players or arcades, it's only 2 or 4 buttons max. Another thought on the interface is players don't read text. We're hoping that they will, but they were not reading anything. So when there's voiceover, if you write it in text as well, it's not gonna work. We did black bar text in our game that was saying kind of what's going on or trying to give instructions. Nobody read that either. And tutorial needs to be somehow without any text. So yeah, biggest things is no thought, no text, and no interface.
Which is much harder than people think, right? Because they think, oh, well, you don't have to do an interface. That should be easy. But it's actually very hard because you got to make it natural, right? Like you said, let's talk about tutorial, which is really the onboarding of the user into the gameplay, right? How important is that onboarding, and what are some tips that you may give other game developers on how to create effective onboarding to provide this game so they can jump in? One of the things that I hate the most about a game is where my onboarding of the game takes longer than playing the game.
Yeah, exactly. In VR, it's extremely challenging because players are already overwhelmed in the first place because they have that headset, there's wires, there's controllers, and it's all new. And then there's tutorial. It's just too much. So the most effective thing to do tutorial is just doing like very bright arrows pointing what needs to be done. And then when player does something right, there's some special effects, some like positive flashlights or sparkles or stuff like that. And it needs to be very short. For VR, maybe 5 minutes tops. And new mechanics should not be introduced like halfway through the game. The players needs to learn what they're doing first 5 minutes and then kind of repeat those actions every 10 minutes, because if they don't, they're just going to forget what's going on.
Right. What about locomotion and spatial considerations? I mean, how can you make it so it becomes fun and effective, but yet I don't need a huge room? So one question is on spatial considerations, but the other one is on locomotion. And obviously, if you make it too real, where people are moving like you move in real life, but you're not moving in real, physically moving in reality, then people get sick. So I guess it's a two-part question. What are your thoughts on spatial considerations, and then your thoughts on locomotion?
So for spatial consideration, it also was like a learning process, not something we kind of started with when we're like, yeah, this is right. Now the standard is you need to design the game for 4x4 space and like make sure the player don't walk too much. Ideally, no walking at all. So it should be either teleportation or free locomotion, but in the reality, player just stands in one position and sits down or like moves when they need to fight or something. And during our play tests, people were constantly bumping into the walls and falling. It was like kind of dangerous because in our game, we allow them to walk a lot, and we probably should have not done that. So, yeah.
You mean walk in physical, in real life walk?
Yeah, in real life.
Right. So it's mapped, the 1 foot walking is mapped to 1 foot walking in VR.
Yeah. People usually, even though there's that blue net in Vive and there's something similar in Oculus too, but people ignore that. They just know, I want to walk. When they're immersed, they completely forget that they actually in some real room.
And some people even turn it off. Like for me, I only put the blue at the bottom of the floor, not as a wall. So I'm kind of warmed, but I hate the wall coming up. So I just want a sort of a warning at the bottom of the floor and not see the wall. So sometimes I ignore it myself. So I totally get that.
Yeah, it's very tempting to, design the gameplay where you can freely walk around, touch everything and do whatever, but there's limitations to that. And ideally, a player needs to just stand in one position. And for arcades, it's also becoming kind of standard that it's 4x4 space per player. So you need to have that in mind. And also what we learned from the players' feedback is all the players like free locomotion. They don't like teleporting. For some reason, it just doesn't feel natural to them. And all the gaming players, they are used to that, running in all those console, like all those AAA big games. So they already kind of have that skill. And when we're limiting them with teleporting, it just feels very interrupted for them. So they want to just stand in one position and in VR to run everywhere. And another group of players who are more like first-time user arcade players, it's also better for them to have free locomotion and for them to be standing because they are first-time users, they are not aware, and it's just dangerous. They're just going to bump into the walls.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about haptic feedback. How do you use that in gameplay?
Haptic feedback is pretty critical for combat. So if the gameplay involves any kind of fighting, shooting, or even petting the animals or something, this is very critical. The controls need to vibrate, they need to shake, something needs to be happening because it's still very early days and you can't make a fast-paced combat in VR game as you can do in a PC or console game where, things are happening all at once. There's all kinds of monsters. There's all kinds of, animation and special effects. In VR, it's very hard to do because your FPS will drop and it's going to be just hard. So you need to use any way to give feedback to a player. And haptic feedback is a very good option to do that.
Any tips for not overdoing it? Because, it's got to feel natural, right? Like when you're shooting a gun, how do you know for how many milliseconds do you give that feedback? Do you have control over that?
The only way to kind of try it is to play test. And I think in VR, you need to play test your game way more than traditional game to kind of see what feels right. Which entire we play tested, I think at least like 100 times or even more than that. And we were constantly collecting feedback from actual players, what feels right, what doesn't feel right. And then you kind of just balance it out. Like if it was too much shaking of the controller or not.
Have you experimented with haptic suits yet?
No, not yet. There's so much of this, hardware and devices we just can't.
Right. Like the Tesla suit looks amazing.
Oh my God, there's a Tesla suit?
Yeah, it's not Tesla from Elon Musk. It's not that company. Okay. No, they call it Tesla suit. It's a different one. But it has, I don't know how many points of haptic throughout the entire body, plus temperature controls. It's got a bunch of stuff.
Wow.
So it looks pretty interesting. Yeah. So, we covered a lot of different topics. Right now, to control anything inside of VR, you're using basically your hand controls, the Magic Touch or whatever. You're using the touch controllers or the Vive controllers. What are your thoughts on how to use the controllers and also like Magic Leap, right? Are you doing anything with that?
No, we didn't explore Magic Leap yet or development for Magic Leap. Our first thought when we jumped into VR was to just bring the experience we already have, which is building adventure games, to VR and do what we can do what we're good at, which is like, dark fantasy, adventure stuff. And Magic Leap is it has a little different mission. We feel like not as much of an entertainment as Vive or Rift. So it's very new for us. So we haven't experimented yet. We're mostly focused on entertainment at the moment.
Right. What are your thoughts on passive versus full agency? What's the right balance for that effective gameplay?
So in VR, you need to let a player to interact with literally anything on the location.
So you believe in full agency?
Yeah, full agency. It needs to be very carefully designed. So there's no like random doors or no random chests or nothing that attracts attention that cannot be interacted with. And we saw that players do appreciate when there is a vase that don't participate in the gameplay, but you can still break it. And they appreciate it a lot. And like in traditional games, it's kind of old news and it's not as fun, but in VR is a lot of fun. Just the exploration of environment is also a part of the gameplay. And that's also an advantage of VR.
I have to agree 100% with you because I'm the same way. Like if I'm exploring a game, my first thing is to touch everything. I guess I'm a little kid in VR, right? I got to touch everything. And I want to grab it and I want to throw it or whatever. And it makes me mad when there's stuff in front of me that I go for it and nothing happens. I can't do anything with it because it kind of breaks that immersion. But then again, what's the balance from a developer point of view, right? From making everything interactive, because when you're doing that, you're adding more time and cost to the game, right?
Yeah, from like a cost standpoint, you can do little tricks with that. Like you can use the same vase, but with a different texture on all locations. And you can just multiply all these objects and place them in different locations. And in our studio, that's what level designer is doing. So they just know there's like 20 or 30 objects that can be interactable and their mechanics is already like coded. So they just place them everywhere so player can touch them and then location kind of look natural. It looks real.
Right. No, that makes sense. So do you keep a library of objects that already are coded and basically you just change the way they look a little bit from game to game? Is that something you recommend to speed up the development process?
Yeah, that is something I definitely recommend, especially for more of an indie developers. In VR, you can't right now put a lot of money, into development, so you need to be creative and need to be effective.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk about audio. How do you use audio to make gameplay effective?
So for VR, when it comes to audio, I think voiceovers are important because usually people don't mute them in VR games and they do in flat games. So high quality actors, voiceover actors are a must and you need to really put a lot of effort in managing, recording for the audio. And that's how players will actually learn some of the story and gameplay because they can't read. I mean, they can, but they will not. Like, voiceover is the most important. And another thing that is important is when player does something right or wrong. And in VR, it can be exaggerated a little bit because players are already confused and overwhelmed and they just need a validation, an extra validation when they defeated an enemy or solved a puzzle or opened some door or something. Yeah, and enemies needs to be kind of loud for you to kind of understand, are you doing something right or not? And all this, audio companies and vendors, they already kind of learned how to do this 360 sound. So as developer, you can not think about it. They will take care of it.
Right, but positioning sound in the right location is very important, right? In other words, using spatial 3D sound.
Yeah. How we worked with audio is we just put placeholders and triggers into the game where the sound's supposed to be. And then the sound designers, they just do their own thing and we don't get involved completely.
You leave it up to the sound designers to figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely. So let's talk about LBEs. I don't know if you're doing anything with LBEs, location-based entertainment, but one of the big things in LBEs is you can map the virtual world to the real world. So if you sit down in a chair in virtual reality, you're sitting down in a chair in the real world, right? Are you guys doing anything with that? And what are some considerations with regards to gameplay for LBEs?
very excited for LBEs, and we are excited about arcades, and we are planning to do an arcade version of Witching Tower. The gameplay will not require any physical objects in the arcade, but the player will be like standing in one spot and playing the game, and the game we're building for that out of Witching Tower will be slightly different game. So I can talk a little bit about how design for arcade is different from the single player home experience. Location-based entertainment, when there is, like wooden blocks and stuff, this looks amazing and super cool, but it's not something we're exploring yet. It's not something we're going to do because, to my understanding, it will require way more design effort than anything else. And as a developer, you would kind of need to have that physical location to build that experience.
Right. As a designer of the game, right? You have to be there and...
Yeah.
Right. No, that makes total sense. So we started the conversation talking about HTC and how they're releasing the eye tracking. Part of the eye tracking capabilities is foveated rendering. And hopefully with that comes along with selective focus, right? Like in real life, I look at something up close and it's in focus and everything else is out of focus and vice versa. And with foveated rendering, we know, it's high resolution where I'm looking, the rest of it is lower resolution. Have you put any thought of how that's going to affect future gameplay?
For the gameplay, I don't know if that can affect...
Well, like for example, selective focus, right? Where I can bring focus and put everything else out of focus based on where I'm looking at. Would that be something that could help gameplay?
It can definitely help optimization, that's for sure. Because right now, you're kind of rendering a lot of stuff in high resolution, and that brings your FPS down, and it's just very challenging for developers. Right. Yeah, with this eye tracking, hopefully it will help with that. For design purposes, maybe it will affect combat mechanics too, and will help with that. So the enemies that are up close, they are fully high-res rendered, and the other ones are not. And that's kind of how it is in AAA console and PC games right now. But in VR, I don't know if anybody figured it out. So yeah.
Right. I think they're all waiting for eye tracking, which hopefully now with the HTC Vive Pro Eye, maybe all future ones will start implementing that technology. So what tools do you use for gameplay, for designing the gameplay? You mentioned at the top of the podcast, your process, right? Of how do you break it apart and how do you design the gameplay and the mechanics. But do you use any specific tools, or are you using just Google Docs or whatever?
For mechanics and sequence descriptions, yeah, we basically use Google Docs, and a lot of design requires some sketching. So the artist will sketch things in Photoshop. And when it comes to level design, we use blueprints because we work with Unreal Engine. And that is basically the tool set. Yeah, so just basically Google Docs and blueprints. That's the tool set.
Very cool. Well, we're getting pretty close to the end here. I did want you to give us a quick, maybe 1 minute overview of the Witching Tower. And I believe it's available. Do they just search for Witching Tower VR in Steam?
Yeah, it's available on Steam and Oculus Store.
Oh, it is on Oculus Store too. Okay, we'll put links to it on the show notes, but give us a 1 minute elevator pitch. What's Witching Tower? What is it about?
So Witching Tower is a first-person action-adventure game where a player needs to escape the Dark Tower and find an undead army and defeat the evil queen who kind of started all that. We put a lot of effort in the atmosphere and the environment storytelling. The game is pretty dark and mysterious. You solve puzzles, you fight skeletons, you solve the mystery, and you also do some VR-specific mechanics like lasso.
So moving into the future, are you going to be focusing more on VR? Because you mentioned that you do a bunch of games, and most of them, I think, for mobile, right? And you just got into VR. Are you going to slowly start migrating into VR, or are you going to continue kind of keeping it even?
We're probably going to keep it even just because VR is still early and can't really justify the development cost. We put a lot of our own money into that area of development, and we don't expect immediate return, and we understand it will be a few years, but it's still as a studio, you need to survive somehow.
Especially as an indie studio. Yeah, you got to make money. Yeah, no, that makes sense. The population of VR is still pretty small, right?
Yeah, it's very small. The home user base, like just single player users who have their headsets at home, it's very small, it's tiny. But we're very excited to see how arcade user population is growing. And that's why we're looking into building an arcade version of our game, which will require way simpler game design, absolutely no onboarding, and possible redesign of locations and some mechanics. But we're up for that because the single player version of Witch and Tower is like 6 hours long. There's a lot going on, a lot of environments, a lot of art, but the arcade game can be 30 minutes and it'll be enough.
So, final question. You mentioned the gameplay is about 6 hours long. How long did it take you to design the gameplay for a 6 hour long gameplay?
On average, to design like what's going on in one location, which is roughly like 30, 40 minutes of gameplay, it takes about a week.
So 6 hours would be about 12 weeks around, plus or minus.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it takes a while, right? And that's just designing the gameplay, not even talking about coding and graphics and everything else.
Yeah. For us, it took about a year of full production for that game.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, Marianna, it was really fun speaking with you. I have one last question for you. I ask all my guests this question. Describe, if you had power to basically do what you want with VR, what would VR be like in the future?
I would like it to have very low entry barrier for any kind of users. So standalone headset with no wires whatsoever and very powerful headset. So the person can take it anywhere, play anywhere, and play really high resolution, fast-paced games anywhere they want. So that would be like ideal scenario for me. And I'm glad to see that it's kind of moving towards that direction.
When do you think that'll happen in your mind?
In my mind, I think maybe 2 more years.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you got the Quest coming out, right? And then from there, it'll just improve.
Yes, that's the goal.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Marianna. I really appreciate it. If people want to get a hold of you, how can they do that?
You can send me an email at marianna@dailymagic.info or send a message on Facebook or Instagram. I'm a big fan of Instagram.
Very cool. Well, thanks again, Marianna, and to the rest of you, I'm glad you were here with us. Just a quick reminder, if you want to access all of our live events, tutorials, practice assets, podcast interviews, videos, and more, register for free at howtocreatevr.com. It's quick and easy. Finally, if you want to attend our meetup in virtual reality, join us inside Altspace VR. Just visit howtocreatevr.com/AltSpaceVR and subscribe to our channel. So until the next episode, I'm Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.